If I speak at maximum velocity, I might get through all my notes tonight. There's no telling. So we'll see. If not, we might have to break this into two pieces, and that wouldn't be the worst thing ever. We'd survive. Yeah, someone will. I have no doubt. Like, you got hand grenades ready to lob my way. We're going to talk about Christian marriage. And before we dive in too far, I have disclaimers because it's that kind of lesson. Disclaimer number one, we will talk about marriage and divorce in the general case tonight. So here's how it normally happens. Someone says we want to talk about marriage and divorce, and then someone says, yeah, but, and we have a very specific counterexample that we want C.S. Lewis to weigh in on, to which C.S. Lewis, remember the name of the book is Mere Christianity, not specific Christianity. It's just in the general case. So don't take this as a judgment even on your particular situation. There are divorced and remarried people who will hear this lesson, and I don't know your circumstances, and neither did C.S. Lewis in 1942. This is just a general account of, in general, what does Christianity say about marriage and divorce if we were just to take that and boil it down. Disclaimer 2, Lewis has lots of controversial opinions in this chapter, so buckle up. I had forgotten. I reread the chapter this week and thought, oh, that's in here too. Oh, that's this chapter. Oh, that's this chapter. And I kept thinking, man, how much trouble is he going to get me into in the course of like 4 pages? But he has a lot of things to say. I don't necessarily disagree with very much of it. It's C.S. Lewis. It's brilliant, but it'll get your wheels turning a little bit. So just kind of buckle up, okay? Huh? It's safe to be in here with your wife, but don't go home together. Yeah. No. Yeah. And remember, this is a study of C.S. Lewis, who is himself studying the Bible, not specifically a study of the Bible. So we're allowed to disagree with C.S. Lewis and still believe in the Bible, is my point. Or we might say, yep, that's it exactly, and then whatever. Number 3 is a disclaimer C.S. Lewis himself gives. He says, I've never been married myself and therefore can only speak at secondhand. When he wrote this in 1942, he was a bachelor and had never been married. He goes on to say, if you disagree with me, of course, you will say, he knows nothing about it, he is not married. You may quite possibly be right. But before you say that, make sure that you are judging me by what you really know from your own experience and not by ideas you have derived from novels or films. So he's quite the antagonist to romanticism. The fact that it's in your romance novel isn't the way that actually has how it works. In other words, him basing his opinion on being a bachelor is at least as realistic as your favorite romantic comedy. Okay? He says probably neither are really great pictures of how marriage works. So, ease up on the judgment about it as you go. He did end up getting married, which is important to note. In 1956, you looked ahead in my slides and you knew it was coming. He married a lady named Joy Davidman, 1956, so it had been 14 years after Mere Christianity. They were happily married for 4 years, and then she dies of cancer at the age of 45. And then at that time, he writes another famous book called A Grief Observed, which are his reflections on love, death, grief, and all those things. And he writes it in the same year that she dies of cancer, which is remarkable. Kind of how he processed it was in writing. So in a perfect world, I'd love to say in 1960, let's go back and revisit the marriage chapter. Do you feel the same way? Did you learn anything? I'd like to know. But we don't get that. You do get Grief Observed. I was going to say it's a fun book. It's not a fun book. It's a good book to read if you're looking for something on just the experience of grief. It's pretty raw and beautiful in its own way. But not tonight. Tonight, we're just going to dive in and get into trouble on marriage. Okay, so first question, what is, in general terms, and I'll say that one more time, general terms, not talking about specifics, in general term, what is the Christian idea of marriage? Lewis says, the Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's word, that a man and a wife are to be regarded as a single organism, for that is what the words one flesh would be in modern English. This is the big key idea. He kind of translates it for us. Your Bible says they're one flesh. If we were talking about that in a modern biology classroom, we'd say they're as if they are one organism. What's he referring to there? He says it's Christ's words. Where did Christ get them, by the way? It's Genesis. Yeah, I mean, he didn't, it doesn't start with Christ. It starts in Genesis 2, where this phrase, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Okay, so there's some sense in which you stop being part of that and then become part of this new entity. Christ then will quote that in Matthew 19, which I think we read last week, verses 4 through 5. Have you not read? Haven't you read Genesis? Yeah. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So whatever you read in Genesis, that's the right answer. That's basically the Christian doctrine of marriage. And in case you still weren't sure, guess what passage Paul's going to quote? In Ephesians chapter 5, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Paul goes a step further and says the metaphor actually is going to help us here to learn something about the church. But he also then reaffirms that the Genesis metaphor, quoted by Christ, now quoted by Paul, that is, if you're looking for an official Christian doctrine of marriage, that's got to be it, because it's the one everybody quotes. So that's it. Sure enough, if you fast forward a ways and pick up the Book of Common Prayer, which is where I draw a lot of my material from when I'm preaching a wedding, it starts out like this. Dearly beloved, I don't know why we can't say beloved, but for some reason in that paragraph it's beloved. It has lots of syllables. Dearly beloved, we have come together in the presence of God to witness and bless the joining together of this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The bond and covenant of marriage was established by God in creation. There's our Genesis reference. And our Lord Jesus Christ adorned this manner of life by his presence and first miracle at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. It signifies to us the mystery of the union between Christ and his church. That's the Ephesians reference. And Holy Scripture commends it to be honored among all people. The union of husband and wife in heart, body, and mind is intended by God for their mutual joy, for the help and comfort given one another in prosperity and adversity, and when it is God's will, for the procreation of children and their nurture in the knowledge of the love of the Lord. Therefore, marriage is not to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Well, it's a lot more words than Genesis, but in principle, that sounds like the kind of things we heard in Genesis, and then in Jesus, and then in Paul. This is what God created, has a purpose, one flesh kind of language, unified, unity, connects to Christ and his church, all those things. Okay. Lewis says of Jesus, he was not expressing a sentiment, but stating a fact. Just as one is stating a fact when one says that a lock and its key are one mechanism, or that a violin and a bow are one musical instrument. That was a nice metaphor. He says that we do recognize there are things that have two parts but are still one thing. Right? If you have a bow or you have a violin, you don't really have the whole thing until you have them both. Lock and key, kind of useless. Or we say lock or key, useless. Lock and key, useful. Right? So there are some things that are just made to be together and aren't complete until they are. And so he says this isn't sentiment. This isn't, oh, what a great metaphor. He says this is just a fact of how God made us to be. What are some Christian marriage norms? He has a lot to say. I'll summarize some of it. He says, sexuality outside marriage is as unnatural as eating just for taste and then vomiting the food. He says, sexuality has a function inside the marriage relationship that food, yes, tastes good, but also it does something for the body. And he says sexuality in marriage is both pleasurable and beneficial. He says, where it's outside of marriage, you're seeking the pleasure, but you're not interested in what it does for society or what it does for you spiritually and so forth. You're only taking part of it. And he says that's a mistake. He repeats that husband and wife are a single organism. A natural consequence is that divorce is like dissecting a living organism. Marriage is for life. He says divorce is not just like, well, I'll get a quote in a minute. It's not like just canceling a business relationship. It's more like surgery. And actually, people who, I think any of you have been through divorce, maybe know that more than anybody else. That again, it's not just the end of a business agreement. It's like you sawed off part of your body. I mean, it was a painful experience. Okay? And he says that would make sense if marriage is a body of sorts. Lewis also acknowledges that churches disagree on the specifics of divorce. So if you ask an Anglican, when is it okay to get divorced, they might give you one answer. Lewis is Anglican. Ask the Roman Catholic Church, they'll give you a different answer. Ask 10 Churches of Christ, you'll get at least 9 answers, right? Ask the Baptists to get another one, and maybe 20 more, right? So there's plenty of varieties of kind of like what are the circumstances. And if I were a Carey minister, I would now say, ask all your questions, and I would answer each one. Instead, I'm going to say, churches disagree on the specifics of divorce, and just kind of say, yeah, in general, we're not all on the same page, except they are all agreed that it's more like having both your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership or even deserting a regiment. Like, if you're looking for a metaphor, it's not like business. It's not even like military desertion. He said it's more like amputation. That all Christian churches view it with that kind of severity, no matter where they fall on the specifics of individual cases. Does that make sense? Just generally, you ask your Christian folk, and you say, divorce, good or bad? They're going to say, really, really bad. And not just bad in the sense of moral, but in the sense of, again, of amputation, harmful, right? This is a very, very hard thing to experience. What they all disagree with is the modern view that it is just a simple readjustment of partners to be made whenever people feel they are no longer, I typed this up in a hurry apparently, no longer in love with one another, or when either of them falls in love with someone else. And this is the big point Lewis is going to harp on for several pages, is the idea that marriage has a lot to do with love and almost nothing to do with falling in love. And he thinks those are fundamentally different things. He says, so pretty much all Christians are going to agree, if they understand their own doctrine, that marriage has very little to do with readjustment of partners. One of my least favorite words in marital or premarital counseling is compatible. We have to see if we're compatible. So the first joke I make when someone says that is, the biology works, right? It works, okay? That part's been around for a while. Nothing to argue about there. And then when you talk about personalities, no personalities are compatible. No, not perfectly. We're all really funny shaped puzzle pieces. There's no two people that will never have a misalignment of value or personality or judgment. It's not going to happen. So again, what do you mean by compatibility? It's this false idea that somewhere out there is your perfect someone who is just the other half of you. And when you get with them, it will be easy. False. That person doesn't exist, and it will never be easy, is the biblical doctrine of marriage. The person you're married to is the person you're supposed to be married to, and we know that because you married them. And it will never be easy because you're involved and you're awful. Is that clear enough, right? As long as there's one human involved, it's tough. 2 humans, impossible, right? So yeah, nothing to do with, well, we'll just readjust partners until I find the right one. Wrong. As long as you're involved, as long as you're one of the partners, there's at least one sinner involved, I guarantee you. And then with this feeling that, oh, I felt really good about this one. Yeah, surprise, surprise. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like at the end of the puzzle when you're just really mashing that piece in and trying to get it to work. There's a little bit of that involved. A fun little side tangent he takes that I enjoy and you may not. He says, speaking of divorce, he says, really, we think of divorce in the category of like sexual morality. It has to do with chastity. He says, really, we ought to think of it in the category of justice. He says, it's more like perjury. He says, divorce is more a crime against the virtue of justice than it is against chastity. In the general case, everyone hear that one more time, our disclaimer from earlier. In the general case, divorce is a breaking of a promise, an act of dishonesty. Lewis reminds us that you made a solemn promise in a church, in public. We called them vows and everything, and then you didn't do that. He says the issue there is not so much a sexual one as it is a covenantal one. Did you keep your word? Did you keep your part of it at least? Or as he'll say, here's maybe his most controversial. If people do not believe in permanent marriage, it is perhaps better that they should live together unmarried than that they should make vows they do not mean to keep. It is true that by living together without marriage, they would be guilty of fornication. But one fault is not mended by another. This might be my favorite line in the chapter. Unchastity is not improved by adding perjury. He says, if you don't intend to stay married anyway, just stick with the first sin. Don't add another one, right? Don't pretend to be married. You didn't have any intention of being married. He says you're still wrong, but at least you're only wrong once. And again, I think he's being a little flippant there on purpose to kind of make his point that marriage has more than just a sexual component. There is this promise you make to another person. He says that has to matter all on its own, separate from the first question. And I think that's an interesting point. He says it in the most inflammatory way possible to kind of like poke you into thinking about it really hard. And I've been thinking on it all day. But anyway, it'll keep me up tonight. Okay, well, what about love? Ben, I've seen romantic comedies. I know how this works. What about love? Does love have nothing to do with marriage? And Lewis wants to talk about that. He says, those who are in love have a natural inclination to bind themselves by promises. Love songs all over the world are full of vows of eternal constancy. Christian law is demanding that lovers should take seriously something which their passion of itself impels them to do. What's he trying to say there? So we might say, Ben, I love my partner. We're in a committed relationship. Why do we need to get married? We already love each other. Lewis says, have you ever noticed that every time somebody writes a love song or a poem or a sonnet, somewhere in there they start making promises? Like love just naturally makes you want to say to the other person, I'll stick with you forever. Okay? He says all Christian law is saying is, yes, you should do that, and yes, you will say and do it. Say it and do it. He says, so love is a part of it, but it's not the end of it. It's about keeping the commitment that love provoked in you. Love made you say it. Now love has to make you do it. We have to go a step further. And of course, the promise made when I am in love, and because I am in love, to be true as long as I live, commits me to being true even if I cease to be in love. Okay. Suppose we treated real estate this way. I fell in love with this quaint little cottage, and I go to the bank and I get a 30-year mortgage. A year later, I don't like it as much as I did. So I just walk away, and I tell the bank, I loved it then, I don't love it now. I'm looking for a cottage that's more compatible. The bank would say, that's nice, but you signed all these papers that said you would pay it in this amount. You can sell it, you can do whatever, but this promise you made when you thought you would live there forever still applies, regardless of how you feel about it. And that's an easy one for us to get because most of us have lived somewhere we didn't want to live anymore. True? Did anybody move? Their first house was your dream home. You just moved right in from the wedding, never left. Most of us have lived somewhere we didn't want to live again, and you changed your mind. And the bank said, oh, okay, don't worry about it. It doesn't even count if you don't like it. No, they said, you have to do something about this because there's paperwork. And Lewis is making the same thing about love and marriage. He says, you made a promise when you fell in love. That's great. When you fall out of love, you're still supposed to keep your promises. It's just a matter of honesty in that regard. So he actually makes a case. When you talk about an unpopular sentiment, he says, I think Christians are committed to maintaining a loveless marriage. Explain what he means by that. He means if you're married and you feel the experience of falling out of love, he says, here's why you should stick to it. But again, because he's Lewis and he's inflammatory today, he's going to say, this is the Christian case for a loveless marriage. Obviously, let me just clarify, he's not suggesting you intentionally get into a loveless marriage, or that if you love your spouse, you stop so you can enjoy a loveless marriage. He's saying, if one morning you wake up and say, I'm not sure if I love the person in bed with me anymore, here's a reason you should stick it out. Number one, again, honesty and promise keeping. You have to think about, I gave my word, I'm standing in a church, I said it out loud. That has to matter. No matter what we think of morality, keeping our word has to matter. Two, there may be children involved. And while we're talking general case here, and there's always more circumstances than anyone knows, I have seen too many marriages that dissolved without consideration for the long-term impact on children. And it is a huge impact. I've got a study in my office, I think it came out in '99, so it's now 23 years old. But it was the first long-term 30-year case study. Like divorce kind of really ramped up early 70s. They did a 30-year study of the children of divorce and tracked them to say, like, how does that play out? You don't need to read it. You want to guess. It's overwhelmingly negative outcomes for that group of kids they studied over a period of decades. And I'm assuming the last 22 years have not changed that. To protect women, number three. This is an interesting one, just in case you think he's a real misogynist or something. He says, a lot of women forego a lucrative career in order to get married and have kids. And then the husband leaves, keeps his career, and she is now 10 years behind in hers and can never have the earnings and job security that he has. And then he marries a younger woman and off they go, right? So she sacrificed her potential career to do this other thing, and then he traded her in. He says, that's not fair to women. Now, Lewis is not so feminist as to say women should never do that. He says, yeah, sometimes women will choose to do that and say, a woman will accept the fact that I'm not going to be the CEO because I want to be a mother. He says sometimes that happens. But he says then the reciprocal has to be true. That if that's going to be their decision, our decision is going to have to be to take care of them because they made a sacrifice to be married to us. And that has to matter. I thought that was an interesting point. And then for about a page and a half, he goes on about this fourth thing that he says, I find a little hard to explain. I think, oh, good. It's marriage and divorce night, so of course we need a point that's hard to explain. What could go wrong? He says, being in love is a good thing, but it is not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also things above it. Written like a true literature man, right? Is he opposed to romance? Crying out loud, he's C.S. Lewis. He loves a good romance, right? He thinks they're great. He says, it's just not the best thing. The feeling of love, of being in love, he says, is a fantastic feeling. It's just not the most important thing in your life. There are things more important, there are things less important. It's important, just not most. If the old fairy tale ending, they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day after or before they were married, then what it says then it says what probably never was nor ever would be true. He says, I don't care what your romantic novel said, he said, there's never been a couple that 50 years later felt the same as they did the day before they were married. What's worse, he said, and it would be highly undesirable if it were. And I love this little bit. Who could bear to live in that excitement for even 5 years? What would become of your work, your appetite, your sleep, typos all over the place, your friendships? Like, listen, I would be candid a minute. I was a young and aspiring astrophysicist when I married Shermai and Celine McKnight. My grades went down a little bit the first year of our marriage because I was Twitter-pated. I was in love. That's a good word. It's from Seminole. We use that all the time. I was in love, and I didn't pay as much attention to homework as I did to going on dates and making moony eyes at my wife and whatever else, and dreaming and staying up late and telling jokes and doing married things, right? My grades went down. I skipped class a lot, right? If you live that way for your entire 50 years of your marriage, civilization would be doomed. Young people in love are stupid. And I'm glad they are. It's beautiful then. And that's his point. Being in love is great. Lewis himself got to enjoy it. Right? But staying in that like newlywed sensation for the rest of your life, not even a good idea. And he argues it's supposed to grow into something deeper. Okay? He doesn't use this metaphor, but I will. Because I'm going camping tonight. Okay? You start your campfire, and how does the fire start? Just like once you get it off the ground a little bit, how does it start? Bright, beautiful flames, right? Because that's how I do it. I pour stuff on it, make it burn to the heavens, make them call the fire marshal to let them know I'm there. Great big fire, okay? Then an hour later, it dies down, and you got these embers that keep you warm the rest of the night. And that is how love is supposed to mature. It's supposed to be flashy at first. It'd be weird if it wasn't. It's supposed to be calmer, deeper, and warmer towards the end. It would be weird if it wasn't. It's supposed to. It's the backlog, the log that burned down, that keeps you warm through the night, not the twigs that burned up in the kindling. Right? Kindling doesn't keep you warm. And that's the way love is supposed to work. But of course, ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. He's making a distinction. One is a feeling that I can neither command to stop nor start. One is an action or a behavior that can be commended of us. Love, he says, is a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by the grace which both partners ask and receive from God. Yeah, that's good stuff. Okay. So what is love? Deep unity, right? Not kindling, something deeper in. Deeper in. Maintained by the will. Okay? You have to want to love. You can't choose all the time how you feel. You can choose to love. According to Lewis. That's his take on it. It's strengthened by habit. Isn't that funny? That we think like love is spontaneous, crazy stuff. Lewis says actually it's having coffee every morning with the same person for 40 years. Like love is increased and maintained by the creation of habits. And then it's reinforced. The only way it can work, because again, there are no compatible people. Two sinners get married every time. It's reinforced by the grace which both partners ask and receive from God. But in Lewis's mind, he doesn't mind telling you Christian marriage is this huge thing that nobody can live up to, because he agrees you couldn't do it unless God helped you. Christian marriage is such a high calling that it wouldn't be possible without divine help. Something less than that is possible without divine help. There are other sorts of marriages out there. But the one he's describing, well, you need God to get it done. And it just so happens that's what Christians believe. And in that vein, it's reminiscent of the kind of love Paul describes in the passage that every bride wants me to read at her wedding. If I had a nickel for every time. And what's funny is when a lot of times a bride, especially a young bride, will ask me to perform the wedding, and I'll say, are there any I hate to even ask, are there any particular passages you'd like included in the ceremony? Have you read that one passage about love? It's like, no, I've never heard of it. Is that in the Bible? Yeah. The chapter's not about marriage. It's actually about how a church works. But in principle, it works, doesn't it? Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Which of those vocabulary words are emotion words? Irritable. I was reading. I was like, that might be one. Irritable might be an emotion, right? Or at least it's connected to emotions. Maybe rejoice. I don't know. Even there, it's saying you pick what you rejoice over. So there's some choice involved. This isn't a sonnet, is it? Like this isn't. My love for you is like the rising of the sun. And it's not emotional language. It's behavior language. Patient, kind, no envy, no boasting, not arrogant, no rude. These are things that are behaviors, not feelings. That's what love is. And there's a reason that works. So just kind of big points to summarize where he's been headed with this. I might get done after all. Well, I know what's coming next. I'm not going to do that. Point one, love is not the same as the thrill of being in love. And he calls it a thrill. He's like, yeah, it's great. It's not the same thing. Big point number two, falling in love isn't some irresistible force that just happens, right? Like any other emotion, you get some say over it. Just the way it works. You're going to have to kind of rein that one in and decide what you're going to do with it. It's not an irresistible force. It's just a thrill, and it's great. It has to be managed. I'm inclined to think that these irresistible passions are much rarer in real life than in books, at any rate when one has grown up. Like maybe when you're young and maybe when you're reading romance novels, everything is just falling in love, he says. But in real life, or at least grown-up life, it's a little more complicated than that. There's behavior involved, choice involved. It's a longer-term commitment. Then he goes on a bit about, so what are we going to do with this? Because remember, Lewis is also very interested. He's writing to a country of good British folks who are already kind of sliding into a post-Christian era. Before the United States ever thought that was cool. A lot of British people are already saying, we're not really Christian anymore. And he says, okay, so what do we do? Are we allowed to legislate the Christian view of marriage and say that's what everybody should do? He makes this funny joke in classic C.S. Lewis style. He said, he says, to be fair, I wouldn't like it if the Muslims were in charge and made a law against wine. He drinks all the time. C.S. Lewis is a fun guy to be around at parties. He says, I wouldn't want some religion just saying, these are our moral laws, therefore it's the laws of the country. He says, because I might not like their moral laws. I like our moral laws. He says, so how do we do this in a country where we admit up front there's going to be people from more than one religion, and not all of them Christian? He says, a great many people seem to think that if you are Christian yourself, you should try to make divorce difficult for everyone. I do not think that. Okay, why not? Churches should frankly recognize that the majority of the British people are not Christians and therefore cannot be expected to live Christian lives. Again, his point of view is it's a little controversial, he has such a high view of marriage, he believes a non-Christian couldn't do it. Like it could only work if God helped you. And you're only going to get God's help if you ask God for help. And if you don't believe in God, you're not asking God for help. So I can't expect you to have a Christian marriage because you're not Christian. You can be married. He said it's just not going to be the same thing because you're not even trying to go about it the same way. very provocative position. I had to really stare at that and think about it. He says there ought to be two distinct kinds of marriage, one governed by the state with rules enforced by all citizens, the other governed by the church with rules enforced by her on her own members. The distinction ought to be quite sharp. In other words, in different words, he kind of views marriage, he says Christian marriage is a sacrament of the church. Okay. The U.S. government doesn't pass laws on baptism, does it? It'd be kind of weird if they did. Because baptism is a work of the church. U.S. government doesn't pass laws on communion. Okay, it'd be weird if they did. Churches govern that within themselves. Lewis says Christian marriage is going to have to be governed by Christian churches because I don't expect the government to understand what we're trying to do. It'd be nice, not realistic. He says, so we should teach our people what marriage is and hold them accountable to it, but we shouldn't expect the rest of the government, who doesn't believe in what we're saying anyway, to pass laws that reinforce that. Okay. Interesting thoughts. I had to chew on a little bit. We'll come back to it at the end if we have time. And he says, so much for the Christian doctrine about the permanence of marriage. Something else, even more unpopular, remains to be dealt with. And at this point, I threw up my hands. Thought there's more? Yeah, he had more. He says, so who's the head of the Christian home? To answer this question, Matt's going to come up and cover the remaining. No, I won't do that to you. Who's the head of the Christian home? And provocative thoughts prevail. He says, he's going to reference Ephesians 5:22 and following, so I'll read it. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband's the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Excuse me. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. That's what he's going to reference. So his first point, he says, hey, that's the biblical language. Husband's head of the home. That's what Christianity says. Now he's just trying to say, why have Christians thought that for so long? So he doesn't even contest the question. He just says, traditionally, that's the Christian view. Why would we think that? Question one, why have a head at all? Why not have two perfectly equal partners? He says, well, because there's two of them. Right? You ever have a vote between two people? As long as they agree, it's fine. When they disagree, one either has to submit to the will of the other, or they have to go their separate ways. I'll repeat that, because I actually hadn't thought of it quite like that until I read this chapter. And it gave me pause. I'm not sure I buy in, but it gave me pause. If you have a group of two people, and you treat it like a democracy, as long as they agree, it's fine. If they ever disagree, either they have to go their separate ways, and we already said we're not doing that, or one of them has to give in and submit to the other. So Lewis says, if you want this thing to last, someone's going to have to make some final decisions, and someone's going to have to say, fine, on some things. And he even comments, he says, ideally they would talk about it, and they would come to a perfect understanding, and everybody would get along. I want a show of hands for everyone who's married who ends every conversation like that. Both of you are exactly on the same page by the end of the conversation, and you say, we think exactly the same, don't we, dear? No. Just Crystal, I know. No one else. It's not how it happens, right? At the end, either nobody gets what they want, or one of you gets some of what you want, and one of you doesn't, right? That's more likely. So Lewis says someone has to cast a tie-breaking vote. Otherwise, we got to part company. We don't want to part company. So we pick. We say, okay, that person breaks the tie. This is how we settled dinner debates in my family growing up. There was a family, dad, mom, 4 kids. Where do you guys want to eat tonight? Okay. 5 votes would be cast for McDonald's. And dad would say, just so happens, my vote counts for 6. That was his system. Not necessarily recommending it. His system was a little weighted democracy, right, where he had final say regardless. Not even a tiebreaker in his system, just the final vote. Okay, well, fine, you got to have a head. Why couldn't the wife be the head? And here again, Lewis is going to be provocative again. You don't have to agree, but you have to think. He says, Lewis argues that the natural state of feminine psychology is against it. Not because they're not capable. He says because wives, quote, despise the husbands whom they rule. He says in his limited experience as an unmarried man, he says, when I see a husband and wife and the wife bosses the husbands around, she ends up not liking him very much. Now, could that be a stereotype? I don't know. But Lewis says, I've seen it and I believe it. I think when the wife, he doesn't say the husband doesn't like the wife. He says the wife stops admiring the husband when he's weak. Is Lewis's point. Everyone hear that? Lewis's point. Ben is way over here. He says also husband and wife tend to have different goals. A woman is primarily fighting for her own children, and the husband against the rest of the world. He has the last order in order to protest other people from, or protect other people, typo, so many typos, to protect other people from the intense family patriotism of the wife. His argument is, wives are so fiercely loyal to their own family, they would never be able to resolve conflict with other families because they would always want what was best for their kids, even if that meant, slaughtering the rest of you. Right? He has like this mother bear image of womanhood and says, mothers will do anything for their kids. Again, not entirely wrong there. I'm not sure I buy the conclusion overall, but I've known a few mothers, again, fiercely protective. And then he goes on and makes this stereotype comment, which is going to get me in more trouble, but it's fun. If your dog has bitten the child next door, which would you rather deal with, the master of that house or the mistress? You want to deal with the kid's mother or the kid's father? And Lewis again says, in my experience, the father comes out and says, well, we got to do something about this, we got to put up a fence. The mother comes out and punches me. He says civilization would end because mothers will do anything for their kids. Okay? Again, that's his case. He never says you're weaker. He never says you can't control your emotions. He says you have a different priority. Those children grew in your womb, and you will do anything to protect them. The husbands are one step removed and think, well, maybe we could build a fence. Huh? 20% loss is acceptable. Yeah. And then he goes on with this one last. Much as you admire your husband, would you not say his chief failing is his tendency not to stick up for his rights and yours against the neighbors as vigorously as you would like? A bit of an appeaser. And again, not saying I completely agree, but I feel like I have been in an argument or two where Mrs. Williams said, you need to go over there and tell them, I just want to get along, right? And maybe that's just in my relationship. But Lewis says, seems like it happens sometimes. He says the mother figure is committed. And the husband says, yeah, maybe a good fence would work. Clearly some of that is stereotype. I'm not going to say that's the result of clinical psychology. But it was an interesting way, without saying something negative about women, to say it is actually your strength in one area that makes you best fit for one role, and it's the husband's deficiency in another area that makes him fit for his role. It was kind of a funny way of saying it, but I thought it made me laugh. And the chapter ends with the word appeaser, capitalized. I thought that was funny. During World War II, what's the worst thing to be in Britain? Don't appease the Germans, right? Yeah. Your husbands are little weak ladies. Anyway, Lewis does not believe that women are incapable of being heads of families in the sense of intellect or capacity. He simply fears their all-consuming love for their children and family would lead to the end of civilization. In his mind, women are perfectly suited by their love to be wives and mothers, just as men are perfectly suited by their appeasing tendency to be husbands and fathers. Do with that as you will. Discussion questions, I've got lots. And I've tried to talk as long as I could, but I guess we have to answer some. Things I wanted to know when I was done with the chapter. First of all, Lewis spends almost no time at all on what might be considered legitimate grounds for divorce. He just says, in the general case, divorce bad, marriage good. Why does he do that? Probably because, again, it's mere Christianity. He's got 10 minutes on a radio program on BBC. He can't answer all those questions. But there's part of me that would like to see him at least nod in the direction of, it's not an ironclad rule. Most churches make some kind of exception. He doesn't. Why or why not? Should he have? Worth asking. Some of Lewis's view of marriage and love seems prophetic. The part about governments and churches will not see marriage the same way, I kind of feel like 60 to 80 years later we're saying, oh, yeah, you noticed. And he had no idea what the Obergefell decision would be regarding same-sex marriage. But in 1942, he says, I don't count on the government to view it the same way I do. He said, so at some point, probably churches are going to have to say, this is how we do it. This is how we marry. This is how we baptize. This is how we do communion. And I'm not going to trust the government to deal with it. I thought that was interesting. What would his view say to recent debates about marriage? I'm curious. Some of Lewis's view of marriage and love seems influenced by his own cultural stereotypes and have not aged as well. What part of his view might we criticize today and why? And I'll just duck and you can say whatever you want. Lewis assumes the term head means tie-breaking vote, like in writing. He says, HUD, you got to have a tie-breaking vote. What else could it mean scripturally speaking? He never actually defines it. Like, he doesn't do a Greek word study and say, here's what the word headship means. He just says, well, clearly, it's the tie-breaking vote. So I wonder, if he was a New Testament guy instead of a literature guy, I'd say, tell me a little more about that. Dig into that some more. And then, again, as I've said at the beginning, I want to know, would Lewis write differently after his marriage and after his loss? And I want to know, how so?